Thank you for inviting me. I'm Man Yee Kan from Oxford University. The topic is time use of women and men at fertility age in East Asian and Western societies between 1980s to 2010s. The research received financial support from the European Research Council and also received support from the National Institute for Social Security and Population Research. The Japan data are provided through Hitotsubashi University. I'm grateful to Professor Kiyomi Shirakawa for his help in the application for access of Japanese data. And I'm also grateful to Dr. Shohei Yoda for his helpful comments and for translating these presentation slides. The aims of these presentations are threefold. First, to describe time use of women and men at fertility age 18 to 49 in East Asian and Western societies in the last 3 decades. Second, to explore how the gender differences in time use change over the last 3 decades. Third, to explore how the gender differences in time use vary according to age group and family status. We harmonize data in the format of multinational time use studies, which is a harmonized data source for time diaries. That is, people fill in what they are doing during the day in every 10 minutes or 15 minute slots. And the East Asian data are from China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And the years of the surveys are listed in the slides. The group of Western countries from MTUS includes Austria, Canada, Germany, Denmark, Spain, Finland, France, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, the UK, and the US. The analytical samples contain women and men aged between 18 and 49. We will present the average daily minutes that men and women spend on paid work, unpaid domestic work, leisure, and sleep and rest. The samples are weighted, so the distribution of the weekends and weekdays diary is equal to 5. And we will chart the time use on the following activities by gender and regions. We group Western countries according to the policies, types, regimes, conservative regimes, France, Netherlands, Austria, and Germany, Southern European regimes, Italy and Spain, social democratic regimes, Norway, Denmark, and Finland, and liberal regimes, Canada, UK, and US. We will examine the East Asian societies individually. We will further examine how time use vary by age group and period, and family status, single childless, partnered childless, and partner with a child, and single with a child. These are the number of diaries by regions and period. To understand change in gender and time use, there's one main perspective called the Gender Revolution Framework. It is believed that gender revolution will be achieved in 2 main phases. In the first phases, it is women who made most of the changes because of the closings in the gender gaps in educations and more opportunities for women to participate in the labor markets. Accordingly, women increase their time in paid work and reduce their time on domestic work. But in the first phase, men lag behind in adjusting to women's new roles. They still lag behind in contributing to domestic labor. However, with more women participating in the labor markets and they increase their income, so more gender egalitarian practices will be exercised in the family, and men will increase their domestic work time. And this is called the second phase of the gender revolution. Another perspective proposed by demographers is very similar. They also propose that the upheavals in family formations brought by the increase in women's participation in the labor market and more women receive higher educations will make unsettlements in the family, fewer women give babies. However, over time, the society will accept more egalitarian gender values and more equal gender division of labor will be happening in the households. In these times, that the society will reach a more gender egalitarian equilibrium, and then fertility rates will bounce. However, it is also said that societies may settle in varying levels of egalitarianism in gender roles depending on culture, social norms, and the welfare policies of societies. So I made some hypotheses based on these perspectives. First is the gender revolution framework. I hypothesized that women spend more time on domestic work and men compare it to women more time on pay work. And therefore, because in the first phase of gender revolutions, it's more women who juggle between work and family. And therefore, women will have less time on leisure and less time on sleep and rest. And second hypothesis is that when gender revolution progresses, then gender gaps in time use will be decreasing over time. Third, the changes in gender gaps in time use over time will vary according to countries and regions. Fourthly, because family status, like getting married and having children, are the main obstacles for gender equal division of labor. So I expect to find that gender gaps in time use are strongly associated with age groups and family status. So to test whether gender revolutions is still in phase 1 or phase 2, I only tested for Japan. First, I hypothesized that the gender gaps in time use will become less strongly associated with family status over time if the gender revolution progresses to the second stage. However, if the gender revolution is still in first stage and is stalled, we will see that the gender gap in time use will remain strongly associated with family status over time. So let's see some results. So the first slide just gives you an overview of time use by regions and gender. We can see that in the pay work time use chart, that the blue lines representing men's time are much higher than women's time, because men have longer pay work time. But if we focus on Japan, we can see, interestingly, men's pay work times are particularly long in Japan, over 400, almost reach 450 minutes a day, bearing in mind that this is the average hours of weekend and weekday. And women's, relative to men's, their pay work time is about 200 minutes a day. The gender gaps is also high in Korea, but it's particularly high in Japan. Turning to domestic work, again, we see a mirror image. The red bars are particularly high compared to the blue bars. Women do most of the domestic work. And the gender gaps are particularly large in Japan, because Japanese men do relatively little domestic work, about 30 minutes a day, but Japanese women do over 250 minutes a day. And another country that have very large gap in domestic work is Korea. And also in Taiwan, these East Asian countries have larger gender gaps in domestic work. In terms of Western countries, another types of countries that have large gender gap in domestic work is the Southern European countries, the Spain and Italy. The gaps are quite large. Turning to leisure time, we see that in all the countries that the blue bars are longer. So men have longer leisure time than women, ranging from about 50 minutes to about 100 minutes a day, depending on the countries. In terms of sleep and rest, in most of the countries except Japan and Korea, women have longer rest and sleep time. And there are studies suggesting biologically women need more sleep than men. But only in Japan and Korea, men have longer sleep time than women, and about 20 minutes longer. So how this gap change over time. This first line showed how pay work time changed across the period. We focus on Japan first. Probably we see that the gender gaps decrease slightly in the most recent period. Women's more recent years, in the most recent decades, have longer pay work time. So the gender gap reduced. In South Korea, very similar trends. The gender gap is closing, but very, very slowly. In other countries, for example, in conservative countries like Germany, the gender gaps is continue closing, but in other countries like Scandinavian countries and Southern Europe countries, the gender gaps decrease between the first and the second period, but remain more or less the same between the second and the third period. How about domestic work time? How this change over time? We see in Japan again, maybe the top right-hand corner, it changed very slowly. The gender gaps is closing, but extremely slowly. Still, men in the most recent decade do like about 13 minutes a day on housework. In the most recent decades, women still it's just less than 250 minutes a day on domestic work. Similar trends is happening in South Korea, again closed very slowly. In other countries, we see very similar patterns compared to pay work. Like in Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, the gender gaps close between the first and second period, but remains more or less the same between the second and the third period. So how about leisure time? We see gender gaps persist over the decades. But in some countries, like in Japan, in Korea, and in conservative countries, that both men and women's leisure time reduced, so the gender gap remained in the most recent decade. So how about sleep time? It changed very, very slowly over time. The patterns are still the same that in all other countries, that it is more usual that women have longer sleep time, but in Japan and Korea, and men have slightly longer sleep time. But in South Korea, in the most recent decades, that the gender gaps in sleep time closed. And next, we will see how time use change according to age group and family status. In all countries, we can see that in the youngest group, 18 to 29, their time on pay work is shorter for both men and women. Accordingly, also the gender gaps is shorter in the youngest group because there are fewer men and women at this age group enter marriage and parenthood. If we look at family status, it shows easier observable patterns. For example, we focus on Japan first. The gender gap between single men and women is relatively little. But compared to married women and men who are childless, the gender gaps increase substantially. And then when we see that for parents, fathers, and mothers, that the gender gap in pay work time increased further. There's a very sharp gradient observed. Similarly, patterns observed in South Korea, however, there's no gender gaps among single people in South Korea. And the gender gaps happen mainly in the marriage. Between childless married men and childless married women, the gender gaps start to grow quite wide and remain consistent between fathers and mothers. And in other countries, we will also see that the gender gaps increase substantially, especially when men and women enter parenthood. How about domestic work time? Again, the younger age groups, the gender gaps exist already, but it is less substantive compared to the older two groups. In the older two groups, more men and women enter marriage and have become parents, so then the gender gaps increase substantially. Again, we see that by family status, clear patterns, and this time see mostly is the red bar change according to family status. Women's times are, especially domestic work time, is very sensitive to this family status. From single to being married and then have children, say in the case of Japan, we see a clear triangle, a gradient. But in to look at the blue bars of Japan, that men's domestic work time hardly change very tiny, little, according to family status. A very similar pattern is observed in South Korea, but South Korea men, compared to Japan's men, spend relatively longer time on domestic work, but still, compared to women, is a lot less. Again, women's domestic work times is very sensitive to family status. Similar patterns happen in other countries as well, but the gender gap is less substantive compared to these two East Asian countries. How about leisure time? Again, leisure time is sensitive to age group in the older two groups generally, except in the case of China and Taiwan. And in other countries, the older two groups have less leisure time. But the gender gaps remain quite persistent. How about leisure time by family status? It is quite interesting. Again, generally, men have longer leisure time, but there are tiny, small difference when we look at difference by family status. For example, let's look at Japan. So between single women and men, the leisure time gaps exist already, but during marriage, actually, women have slightly longer leisure time than men. And it can be because men have very long working hours. And once having children, however, the reverse happens, that women again have less leisure time than men. So it is the parenthood that directs women have less leisure. In other countries, that the gender leisure time gaps move also across the family status, but actually parenthood in some countries, interestingly, that tend to reduce the gender gap in leisure, for example, in conservative countries. How about sleep time? Again, the youngest group, 40 to 49, in some countries tend to have slightly less sleep time. However, in the oldest groups, is also in some countries, like in South Korea and in Japan, in the oldest group, then the gender gaps in sleep times is more substantive. How about that? How this varied by family status? In South Korea, the gender gap in sleep time happens mainly starting in parenthood. That starting become parents, that men have more sleep than women. And in Japan, again, this through parenthood and also through marriage. Between single men and single women, there's no existing gender gap in sleep time, but once entering marriage and entering parenthood, men have longer sleep time. Other countries in general, like in conservative countries, Scandinavian countries, and other countries, women have slightly longer sleep time. We are interested in trends. We know that now it's unequal, but is it improving or not? So I tested how family status and time varied across the periods, and I tested in Japan. Just taking a very quick glance in these pictures, we see that the patterns look more or less the same across the 3 decades. Still, this family status is strongly associated in men and women's pay work time, and the gender gap is increasing over the family's life cycle. And the same for domestic work. So again, very similar pattern across the 3 periods. Still, family status is the main reason that women increase their domestic work time and make a very big gender gaps. in domestic work. How about leisure time? We see similar gap, but it is more interesting to see the leisure time trend, especially in the most recent decade, 2008 and 2016. We see that both women and men have less leisure time, and the gender gaps in leisure time, in the case of partner, no child, men and women, actually women have a little longer leisure time. So only through parenthood that's driven women have less leisure time. How about sleep time? Very little changes over the decades again. So probably it's time that I try to summarize what I have found. First, concerning the first hypothesis, in all societies and regions, men have longer pay work time and leisure time, and women have longer domestic work time. The gender gaps in sleep and rest time varies according to societies and regions. In all societies except Japan and Korea, women have slightly longer sleep and rest time than men, but in Japan and Korea, men's sleep and rest time is about 20 minutes longer than women's. Secondly, the gender gaps in pay work and domestic work reduced between the first period and the second period, but for several countries, including Beijing, liberal country, and Scandinavian countries, there was no substantial further decrease in between the second and the third period. There's no much change in the size of the gender gap in leisure time over the last 3 decades in most societies, but in a few countries in regions, including Beijing, Japan, the leisure time fertility age men and women have dropped over the decades. Only in Japan and Korea, men have longer sleep time than women. However, the gender gap in sleep time has closed in Korea in the most recent decade. Third hypothesis, we see that in conservative countries, including France, Germany, the gender gaps in pay work, domestic work, and leisure time have continued to fall across the last 3 decades. In South Korea and Japan, the gender gaps in pay work and domestic work time have been large, but have been closing slowly in the last 3 decades. In Southern regimes, including Italy and Spain, the gender gaps in pay work and domestic work times are the largest among Western countries, and the closing of gender gaps in time has stalled in the last decade. So if we compare Western countries and European countries, we see the trends of gender gaps in time use in Beijing and Taiwan is quite similar to liberal countries. If we say how different is Japan compared to Western countries, Japan and Korea, if we look at the gender gaps and the gender time trends, is quite similar to Southern European countries like Italy and Spain. So as for the phase of the gender revolutions, we see a strong gender divisions of pay work and domestic work is observed in the older age group and across the family life cycle, from single to partner and from partner to partner with children. The enhancement in the gender division of labor across age groups and life course stage is strongest in Japan and Korea, and Italy and Spain also follow similar patterns. The increase in the gender division of labor over age groups and life course stages is less strong in countries like liberal and Scandinavian countries. The gender gaps in leisure time remain similar across age groups and family life cycle stage. However, both men and women have less leisure time after they are partnered and have children. In Korea, Italy, and Spain, the gender gap in leisure increases with family formations, especially after having children. In Japan, entering marriage is accompanied with more equal leisure time between men and women, but parenthood increases the gender gap in leisure time. The patterns of sleep time do not vary much according to age group of life course stage. However, in Korea and Japan, men's sleep time become longer than women after marriage and parenthood. And we can see the partnership and parenthood have been closely correlated strongly with the pay work time and domestic work time across the past 3 decades. Women reduced their pay work time and increased their domestic work time substantially after marriage and parenthood. And in the most recent decade, childless married women have longer leisure time than their male counterparts in Japan, but married mothers have less leisure time than married fathers. Men have longer sleep and rest time than women, and the gaps increased over the life course and has remained consistent in the last 3 decades. To conclude that there's still a clear gender patterns of time use among fertility-age women and men. The gender gaps in pay work and domestic work time are larger for married individuals and parents. Women generally have less leisure time than men. In Japan and Korea, the gender gaps in pay work and domestic work are large and have been closing extremely slowly. In several countries and regions, including liberal and Scandinavian countries, the gender convergence in pay work and domestic work time has stalled in the most recent decade. To conclude, marriage and parenthood continue to be correlated with a reduction in women's pay work time and a substantive increase in their domestic work time over the last 3 decades in Japan. Thank you very much.